Hello again. Let's go with the last talk, but not less important. This talk is featured by Ericka Rascón. Ericka is an applied economist working on the observational and experimental studies. She joined the Department of Middlesex University in 2015, where she teaches experimental and econometric methods. Ericka, welcome to the BEHR Summit. I'm impatient to hear you because organizations for sure need to make better choices. How are you?
Very good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, really well.
Now I'm a little bit nervous after that introduction.
No. You are so talented. I think people should watch your talk. Ericka, it's your time. Please enjoy the talk, and people enjoy too.
Excellent. If I just, I don't know how you want to deal with questions. I assume that after my talk, there might be some time for questions. But if it's needed, any sort of clarification, please just let me know. So today I'm going to be talking about the use of randomized control trials, in particular, this type of method for making better choices in companies, organizations. And by better choices, I mean not only improvements of what we want to see in our companies to happen, but also to have informed choices about the decisions that we will make in terms of our employees, organization, in terms of how we're going to organize the technological process that we're following, etc. Randomized control trials are a very, very big topic. I would try to be as concise as possible. Very likely what you're going to be hearing tonight is not going to be very new for you. But perhaps the way that I'm going to be approaching some of the questions that I'm going to be posing during my talk, perhaps the way to think about it might be slightly new for you. Very likely, much more than me and any other experimentalist that you have heard during this day and since yesterday, very likely you have had much more exposure to experiments than ourselves. And the reason is that companies, organizations keep on experimenting in a daily basis and keep on adapting depending on what we observe may have worked or not, what we observe was not very effective, or what we observed that was very effective, and therefore we continue doing it. So what I'm trying to explain here through my talk is how to do that, how to continue doing that, how to continue experimenting, but in a more systematic way in order to build robust evidence about what we learn in the process of experimentation. So the question here is relatively simple. So how do we know that something works? And if it works, can we make it better? Or if it doesn't work, should we stop doing that particular thing? So as a company, I mean, my understanding is that you all have different exposures to different types of technological processes, different types of products or services that you offer to customers. Of course, we're talking about, we can think of different ways of improving our process through changing the quality of our product or service, changing the technological process that we consider on the way. Should we copy technology? Should we do something else about the technology that we are doing? Should we organize our employees or teams in a different way? Should we start hiring different type of people? Should we start hiring different type of composition of teams? Perhaps we do a combination of all these in order to indeed improve our final output, our final product or service. However, when we move several things at the same time, or even when we just move one thing at the same time, but it's with the same individuals, it is really difficult to disentangle whether what we changed was really the cause of what we are observing later on, or if it was just a combination of many things that happened on the way. So let me now focus only on one of many things that you can indeed ask about whether we can improve something about it. So let me just focus on teams, employees. Of course, you can think of RCT setups in order to improve your technological process, in order to improve the quality or quantity of your product. But I just want to focus through all my talk on one thing, which is employees' performance. And I just want to bring you back into the problem that we all have in any single company, organization, team, small supervision teams, whatever you are working, even in universities we see it, as soon as we offer a permanent contract, we run the risk of moral hazard, right? So how can we encourage our people that after they become permanent, they continue improving, they continue acquiring skills, they continue getting updated about the things that they do or they are supposed to do? Or how can we maintain them motivated and have a good culture, a good behavior, a good attitude in the job? So the question is, well, moral hazard is not new for us. We always observe that as soon as we tell our employees, look, you're going to be a permanent employee, we always run the risk of moral hazard. And we always run the risk and the challenge of having monitoring systems or mechanisms to ensure that this moral hazard doesn't become a big problem in our company or organization. So the question is, well, how could we test different strategies, different interventions, different approaches to indeed reduce this moral hazard? Question one, shall we use all school techniques? Shall we just call the employee and we just nag the employee using our human resource unit in order to shake a little bit the understanding of our employee that if he or she doesn't put enough effort in what he or she's doing, then there will be consequences. Now we're in 2020, so probably we cannot be so Machiavellian. So perhaps we want to prove or we want to test other type of approaches. Perhaps we want to experiment by giving a motivational talk, a pep talk to our employees by telling them how important is their role in the company, and without them, the company cannot succeed. Or by emphasizing why we believe that that particular employee or team is so needed in the company in order for the company to succeed. That could be another approach. But there could be other approaches. We could think about incentives, bonuses for good performance. Perhaps people really don't care about punishments, don't care about pep talks, they just care about money. Well, I'm pretty sure that you have tried either one or two or a combination of some of these strategies, or maybe others. Some companies indeed go for the strategy of the employee of the month, which is another type of approach to make our employees to feel cared and to feel that they are part of our organization. It could be another strategy. Here I'm just posing or trying to describe 3 different types of strategies that might be good choices for decreasing the problem of moral hazard. The question is, how should we indeed identify which of these 3 different strategies is the best to improve our employees' performance? So the question is, should we apply all these strategies to the same individual? For instance, firstly, I nag very hardly my employee, but later on, I invite him or invite her for a pep talk. And then if I see that there's no change in behavior, then I call again my employee, and then I say, hey, look, we have some bonus here. So if you become a little bit more productive, if you sell more products, you can have a bonus. And the bonus can be X, Y, or Z. Should we then combine all these strategies in the same individual? Or should we just do a phase-in implementation? So we can try, as I said before, strategy 1, we punish. Strategy 2, later on, we call the person for a pep talk. And later on, we call the person for a bonus. So can we do it like that? What about if we then try all these strategies across different individuals? So how can I proceed, given that there are so many different possibilities or so many different strategies to be used in order to encourage our people to put their best in our organizations? In this particular example that I'm using, we want to know one thing in particular, which is what is the strategy that is the most effective to decrease moral hazard and therefore to increase the productivity of our company and, of course, the profits of our organizations, companies. To answer this, we will use randomized control trials. And what does that mean? Well, that means that we need to have 2 key elements. The reason why we need a randomized control trial is because we will need to know how our employees will have fared in the absence of an intervention, in the absence of this strategy to improve the behavior of the employee. So to implement a very simple experimental idea, which later on I'm going to explain with a little bit more of detail, we're going to need 2 types of elements, very key elements. Number 1, I call it clones. So we need clones that are indeed a group of people, on average, identical to those employees that are supposed to receive the intervention or a strategy. The second element is random assignment. We will randomly allocate our employees to the intervention or to no intervention whatsoever without allowing them to select themselves to either group. And this is the key part of the story. The random assignment allows me to reduce as much as I can the selection bias problem. Why there could be a self-selection bias problem? Well, imagine that you want to interfere in the selection of who goes for the intervention and who goes for the no intervention. And suppose that you think that those that should receive the intervention are those that you believe are indeed sleeping in the office or having too many breaks. Well, the reason why you cannot just choose who goes to the intervention and who goes to the control or to the group that is not going to get intervention is because by definition, you are already using a characteristic that is making these 2 groups not comparable. So perhaps you're seeing a characteristic of one group that makes them more suitable to get the treatment than others, but then this other group cannot be a good comparison group for our group that is going to receive the intervention. So 2 key elements for running a randomized control trial is, number one, we want to have a group of individuals that are our clones, which are on average identical in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, in terms of psychological measures, in terms of levels of productivity, and so on, prior to the intervention. So these 2 types of individuals, the clones that will be a reference group, and those individuals that will be receiving the intervention, these 2 types of individuals need to be identical prior to the intervention. Otherwise, later on, when the intervention happens, I don't know if the difference in outcomes are derived because of those differences that we already had in the beginning, or it was just because of the intervention. That's why we need to be very careful about having these perfect clones to be a reasonable comparison for those individuals that will be receiving the intervention, as well as whoever gets intervention has to be decided through a random assignment. So let me just introduce a couple of wording that I'm gonna be using, but also you're gonna be reading about if you feel quite excited about this RCT method. So number one, we're gonna be calling treatment group those employees or participants that receive an intervention, or in our case, a new strategy to reduce moral hazard. And we're going to call control group or placebo to those individuals that do not receive the intervention, or if it's a placebo, that receives a treatment that is not supposed to change our main outcomes of interest. For the case of moral hazard problems, perhaps our main outcome of interest might be the productivity at the employee level, the final output of the company at the employee or team level, or even the employee satisfaction. Okay, just a formality of the definition of a randomized control trial. The clear definition is this is just a method where we have at least 2 or more groups that are created through random allocation. At least one of the groups receives an intervention, a strategy, a policy, a treatment, and that's why we call it the treatment group, while the other group doesn't receive the treatment, or if it receives a placebo, is a placebo that cannot affect at all our outcomes of interest. And how we calculate the effect of the treatment? Well, once we expose to the intervention our treatment units or treatment group, then we collect data again, and then we measure or compare our outcomes, which could be quantity of the products that we have produced in a specific period of time, or product failure, or employee satisfaction. So we compare these main outcomes of interest between treatment and control groups. Okay, let me now give you a clear picture of how this works. So imagine that you would like to test something using all the Uber drivers in the US. And I want to know, or I want to incentivize better driving among Uber drivers. Okay, so imagine then that if we are interested in analyzing Uber drivers and how to make them be more, much better drivers, so my eligible unit in this particular case will be Uber drivers. They won't be yellow cab drivers. They won't be black cab drivers. They won't be any other type of private or taxi driver. No, it's just gonna be Uber drivers. So that would be our universe. That would be our eligible unit or universe where we are gonna be selecting our sample to study our individuals. So from this pool of Uber drivers, I'm gonna then select just a subset of them randomly, okay? And then I create what we call an evaluation sample. This evaluation sample is just a subset of Uber drivers that then later on I just randomize through a dice or a lottery, where just half of them in this example, I would put them in the comparison or control group, and the other half I would put it in the treatment. So how many Uber drivers I select and how representative this sample is from the Uber drivers will give me an idea about the external validity of my study, meaning how much the conclusions that I'm gonna be getting from this sample, I can then extrapolate to this bigger population. And the internal validity is indeed what not only field experimentalists, but also lab experimentalists are very aware of, is that whoever was selected for the control, whoever was selected for the treatment stays in the group that we assign to them. If there's some sort of crossover, then the internal validity is indeed affected. You can also think about more complicated designs. You can think about not only having these simple control and treatment area or control and treatment units, but you can also continue dividing in additional treatments. For instance, you can say, well, I want a pure control where I don't give anything, but then I want a control for which I offer, in my example of Uber, probably I can offer vouchers for fuel. Then in one of my treatments, I can just give monetary incentives to minimize the complaints about bad driving of these Uber drivers. And then I can mix these two incentives in another treatment. So if you can see what I'm saying in here is that you can make your design as complicated as you want. And of course, that will allow you different crosses of information. For instance, I can always compare the group that received these two different types of interventions with the control. I can also compare these two types of interventions with only those that only received the money. Or I can compare these two guys with those guys that receive only the voucher for fuel, etc. Of course, the more complicated is your design, the more observations, the more participants, the more individuals, the more employees you need in your study. Okay, so how do you start your RCT? Well, number one, you need to identify the problem. So we want to solve something, and that's why we use an RCT. So what do we want to solve? Well, we want to know, or we want to improve employee satisfaction. We want to improve the level of productivity. We want to improve the efficiency of our technological process, just to give examples. I also need to understand the nature of the problem. Even though these three things that I just mentioned, satisfaction, productivity, and technological process, somehow is interrelated, especially when we are talking about technological process that indeed has a clear connection between the capital side and the labor side of the production that you are creating. But it's important to know the following: despite of having these three potential outcomes of interest, which we call main outcomes, right? Because these will be the outcomes that we want to look as the main goal of our RCT. What we need to understand is the different mechanisms that are indeed affecting these different outcomes. Despite of having a lot of interrelations, a lot of interlinkages between these three different outcomes, there might be completely different mechanisms that indeed may encourage different types of behavioral changes. The third thing that you need to think of is whether you want to do it with your own company. Perhaps it's a small company. Perhaps you have multi-plan companies. So then you may want to do it across several companies. Perhaps you are working for McDonald's and you are doing the whole coordination of several McDonald's in the US, in the UK. So you can do it across several companies. You can do it across several districts, across several counties. You need to decide your experimental unit. Okay, let me then explain a little bit how it works, the standard steps of an RCT, and then I'm gonna jump into some specific cases that I selected for today's talk. So basically what I mentioned before is you need to be very clear about who is the population of interest, who is your population, your eligible population, okay? In my example with Uber, well, these guys that are in here, this is my whole universe of Uber drivers in the US. Now, it doesn't need to be at the US level. So suppose that I just want to do it at the New York state level, because that's where I work, that's where I can influence this type of experimental design. So then I'm just gonna focus then on New York Uber drivers. Or let's suppose that your company has different regional branches. So your regional branch is West US. Okay, so then you can do West US Uber drivers. Okay, so in here, the eligible population can be whatever you want. Now, where we really need to be very strict is once you define your eligible population, you need to randomly assign who is gonna receive the intervention and who is gonna remain in the control group. As I said before, this randomization cannot be managed based on a specific intuitions or a specific rumors or advices from people that tells you you should put in the treatment these or these companies or these and these districts. No, this has to be purely random. That means that there should be a lottery in order to select who goes to the treatment, who goes to the control. Once we do this selection, we run our intervention. Whatever is our intervention, could be an intervention on, as I mentioned before, bonuses, could be an intervention of inspirational talks, could be an intervention on punishments, etc. Then, once we do the intervention, we collect data. Let me now emphasize a little bit more when we collect data. We collect data before the intervention. So as soon as we have our eligible population and we do our randomization, we are going to collect data in here. So prior to the intervention, we're going to collect data not only on our main outcomes of interest, but also on sociodemographics, social psychological information, social preferences, whatever you think may interfere with your main outcomes of interest directly or might be important determinants of the chances of participating in the intervention. Okay, just to give an example. So with my example of Uber drivers, perhaps more educated Uber drivers tend to have better driving culture, right? So education might be a sociodemographic variable that might be important if my main outcome of interest is good driving by Uber drivers. But also some social psychological measures might be important, such as the motivation of our Uber drivers or how confident they are about the company's promotions or the company's bonuses, etc. Okay? as I said before, this baseline data collection needs to happen prior to the intervention. The intervention happens, and then once again, I visit or I collect data of my people. With the comparison between the employees that were subject to the intervention versus the employees that were subject to no intervention, that will be the way how I'm gonna be measuring the effect of the intervention on the outcomes of interest. Just a couple of notes about measurement before and after the intervention. You may want to consider variables such as how our employees interact with each other. You may have heard already about cooperation from some of the previous speakers, what their goals are in the company, what they think their role is in the company, employee satisfaction, productivity by team, employee, among many other main outcomes that you can have in mind. Okay, let me now switch a bit. I don't want you to get bored with all this notation, but I wanted to just hear about a couple of field experiments that have been working with corruption, with Uber drivers, as well as with vocational training programs. So I picked 3 cases, and depending on what time it is, I might be able to go back to the 4th case. But the first case is a case that is aiming at, or was aiming at, tackling corruption in Pakistan. This is involving procurement offices. So the procurement offices in Pakistan were the ones subject to the intervention. And these procurement officers had their bosses who were the supervisors. And one of the main motivations for this experiment was that Pakistan, as many other developing countries, faces a lot of corruption, especially in the public sector. So they wanted to see whether switching the autonomy that the supervisors had in terms of what they buy for the company, basically the procurement that these supervisors were used to do or were used to lead, whether this autonomy was indeed a key element for making things more efficient and then reduce the level of corruption. Okay, so this happened in 26 out of 36 administrative districts in Punjab, Pakistan, with about 600 procurement offices. And all these officers were randomly assigned to 4 experimental groups, okay? Experimental groups means treatment group or treatment groups and control. So one of the treatment groups was the treatment group called autonomy. So one group of officers received more leeway in decision-making over expenses through 2 different policies. Another group, another experimental group, received pay for performance, so received financial rewards for good procurement performance based on the quality of goods purchased relative to the price paid. Then another, which is a 3rd treatment group, it's a combination, as the ones that I was explaining before with my figures. This is a combination of the 1st and the 2nd treatment, so autonomy plus pay for performance, where this 3rd group received both of these 2 treatments. And then there was a 4th experimental group, which was just a pure comparison group, where there were no changes whatsoever. The supervisors were still being the ones deciding what sort of products will be bought for the company, and then of course deciding to whom they will be giving the contracts for giving or for providing the goods that the company was needing or the ministry was needing. Okay, so the clear motivation is the following. So most of the organizations that are indeed settled in Pakistan have very strict rules when buying products for the company or for the ministries. in particular for those cases that are in the public sector. And even though these rules were supposed to indeed prevent corruption, because they are so cumbersome, indeed, they are ending up making much worse the corruption issue. Okay, so then the intervention basically is what I just mentioned earlier, is three different types of intervention: autonomy, pay for performance, a combination of these two, and then a control group. What the author finds is that shifting this authority away from the supervisors, moving this authority of procurement to the procurement officers per se, indeed improve the performance of the whole unit. And particularly, this was the effect was pretty strong for those cases where the supervisors were primarily, prior to the intervention, very inefficient and corrupt. They also find, or she also found, that the financial regards for officers didn't make any difference in terms of performance. There's another case that I wanted to talk to you and explain briefly. This is one about US Uber drivers, and this is about shall they apologize? So they wanted to see whether customers were reactive or there was some sort of change in the behavior of customers if the Uber driver offers an apology when there were late pickups or they had the customer had to wait too much time for the car arriving, etc. So the intervention consisted in, this is a very simple intervention because, of course, using mobile phones, you can send messages to a very wide range of customers for a very low cost. So this is basically three different types of apology. One of them is just a very direct apology, such as "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience discussed." The second apology was something like, one said they were idiots for causing the rough journey. So basically another type of message. And the third one was promise the riders that they will never experience such a terrible ride again. There was something that we call reinforcer. So in addition to these three different types of apology, they offer a reinforcer to three other experimental treatments where they gave the chance of giving a voucher for money of their next journey to the customer. The effects that the author, John List, found is that apology by themselves were not very effective, but what it was very effective was the incentive through the voucher. And this is another type of experiment that I ran with a co-author of mine, Ericka Rascón from the World Bank, where we saw very high rates of teenage pregnancy and childbearing, as well as low rates of HIV testing in Malawi among young populations. And we used the setup of a vocational training program to increase human capital of young people and therefore increase the opportunity cost of young people to have children at early stages. What is interesting of this experiment for the current talk is that what we find is the following. So the intervention was the classic vocational training program where you offer different types of trainings depending on the occupation that the trainee select. So you could go for, training to be a better plumber, a better carpenter, a better beautician, etc. So that's a classical vocational training program. But in addition to that, to half of the individuals that were treated, we offer an inspirational talk. And this inspirational talk, just to give you an idea about the costs and how this kind of tiny little tweaks, also in terms of using social psychology in our interventions, how much may improve our strategies. What we find here is that, well, this vocational training program, the cost per individual, it was a 3-month intensive vocational training program. It was for $1,000 per participant, whereas the inspirational talk was about $15 per individual. Okay, so we're talking about massive differences between the vocational training per se and the pep talk. And what we observe is that in the overall, providing human capital to young people through the vocational training program indeed reduced by half childbearing comparing treatment and control group, also increased by 30% HIV testing. But most importantly, all these effects were very strong for those individuals that received the inspirational talk. So basically, you can create interventions, which can be slightly complex or very simple, whatever is your taste or whatever is your need. But it's important to bear in mind that using this combination of soft skills and hard skills can make a big difference to your hard skill strategy. And in this particular context, you can think of training your people with hard skills, with skills that are technical skills, but at the same time, you shouldn't forget that these people are human, and you may need to combine some sort of intervention that consists or encompasses inspirational talks or other social psychology dimensions that can also benefit and boost the effect of your primary strategy or intervention. Okay, so indeed what we observe in our intervention is that the mechanisms that made these changes happen were indeed based on the feelings of being capable of putting a business and being confident to be an entrepreneur that indeed make the individuals to indeed delay the decisions of being early mothers or early fathers. Okay, I'm gonna leave this last example for later if I have time. Let me just say a couple of more things regarding what an RCT involves. Just to bear in mind, an RCT can be as simple as you want. We can think of RCTs that are completely in the field. So you have different companies or you have one company. You can do it within the company. You can partition your experiments within the company, depending on the nature of the experiment. Also, it's important that when you consider experiments that involve information, this information can be passed between treatment individuals to control individuals, which is what we call contamination. So, depending on the type of intervention, if you believe that there could be some sort of contamination because it's within the same company, then you need to think about other strategies in order to avoid that type of contamination, because otherwise you are not going to have a pure analysis of the effect of your strategy or intervention. So that's number one. So number one is you can apply experiments like the one that I'm talking about, field experiments, either in your own company, in one company, depending on the intervention and the nature of the intervention. You can apply it in several companies, okay? And this can be either face-to-face or through mobile phones or through online experiments or through a combination of both, doing face-to-face interviews, etc. So it could be as intensive as you want to do it face-to-face, online or not. Of course, now in the middle of a pandemic, what we are doing in several places is switching quite a lot of our field experiments into online experiments till we can continue proceeding in the field. I have a couple of things in the field right now. IRBs are already giving approvals for running things in the field in the US and also in the UK, but also in some African countries where I have been working. But bear in mind that you can do it in any setup you want. You can use mobile phones, sending messages, randomizing different types of messages, using different types of framing. You can do it using Facebook. Now, we have been running a couple of Facebook experiments which have been very successful. One of them is for improving civic education among young people in Tunisia. It's very low cost and you can reach a lot of people. So you can think of RCT setups not only in the field, face-to-face, but you can also think of online mobile phone setups. Okay. Finally, let me just give you a big picture of some of the different types of randomization that you can run. Number one, we have the simple randomization. So simple randomization, we just run a lottery. Literally, imagine you put the names of each of your employees in a basket. You reshuffle the basket, and then you just take 20% of the names, and then you put them in one of the groups. Then you put another 20% in another group. To make it even fairer, you can say, well, the first one goes to the right, the second one goes to the left, and so on and so forth. So the simple randomization strategy that we even do it with our kids. We have other type of randomization that is a combination that you can use. You might be interested in a specific type of people or units. For instance, if you believe that females behave differently from males, that also means that you would like to test the same mechanisms in the two types of different populations. And in order to ensure that you have enough statistical power, enough observations to analyze your data, you may want to use something that we call a stratified randomization. And that means that instead of reshuffling, in your basket, everyone together, what you're going to have is two baskets, one basket with female names, another basket with male names, and then within the basket of female names, you're going to have control and treatments, and then from the basket of males, you're going to take out control and treatments. That's what stratified randomization means. And then finally, cluster randomization, which is one of the favorite randomizations of field experimentalists like myself. When we are working with companies, several schools, clinics, ministries, health centers, you name it, you know that, again, depending on the type of intervention, let's suppose that we're talking about you would like to change the social norm related to work ethics. And because the social norm involves information, involves motivating your people, it is very likely that if you apply that intervention within the same company, there might be a lot of contamination between control and treatments. As a result, if you have the chance and if you have the setup, you can think of applying different treatments to different groups of companies. So suppose that where you work, you have the chance of having, I don't know, you are running CVS pharmacies, right? CVS pharmacies, when I was living in Washington, D.C., I mean, almost every 2-3 blocks, there was a CVS pharmacy. I don't know how many CVS pharmacies are now in Washington, D.C., but I reckon might be at least 50 CVS pharmacies. So suppose that you have the chance of having access to CVS pharmacies. Let's assume that you have the chance to do it for the whole East side of the US to work with CVS pharmacies to encourage your employees to be more careful with the products that they receive and they shelf during the night and so on. Well, if you have access to, let's say, 250 CVS pharmacies, then you can select, for giving a number, 50 CVS pharmacies for one treatment, 50 CVS pharmacies for another treatment, and so on and so forth. Okay? Okay.
Ericka.
So, yes.
Sadly, we don't have enough time.
Sorry.
We should go with some questions. I think your presentation deserves to be watched carefully, because it's a new approach for HR people. Probably HR people are enjoying so much, but obviously we need to explain it carefully. But I love it. I love it because I'm a true believer that RCT are a very useful tool to be applied in organizations. And talking about that, Pablo asked something. An important issue is how to sell randomization to workers, those who are assigned to the program from those who are not. Perhaps a phasing randomization where every single worker takes finally the program. What do you think about that?
So it depends. So if we're talking about one company, then having several interventions. So depending on the type of intervention. So if I go back to the case of the moral hazard problem, one company for running that experiment can be tricky because you don't want people to get angry. Okay, so you don't want people to think that some got the bonus and then some others got the punishment, no? So what you can do is a phasing design. I mean, the punishment idea is just for just giving different approaches, right? But you can just have a phasing design when for the punishment treatment, it cannot go like that. But you can tell people, look, we're going to be running different strategies. 1/3 of you will receive some of those strategies, another third other strategies, without giving too much information, because you don't want the Hawthorne effect, no? You don't want people to start changing behavior just because they know that something is going to happen, but not because of the content of the experiment per se, no, or the intervention per se.
Exactly.
So yeah, when you don't have the chance to have several companies, I would go for phasing design. Not only that, suppose that you would like to do your experiment multi-plant. You may have several plants, okay? But then this multi-plant is set in India and in Nigeria and in Mexico and in the US. And all of them have completely different cultures in terms of how to proceed with randomized controlled trials. Some of the countries, indeed, may not want to have people outside of the intervention. They may even feel it that is not fair for them, okay? We have situations with some governments when they say it's impossible to have a group with no intervention whatsoever, especially if you know that the intervention is going to change the life of people, no? So in that type of case too, it's good to offer a phasing design, no? So you can negotiate, especially when you have multi-plans and you need to deal with different countries, which may have different cultures regarding this type of experiments. You can always offer a phasing design where you just randomize the order of who goes first. Yeah. Of course, the caveat to that is that at the end of your project, there's no control. No?
Yeah.
So you can just measure at the end of the project just the intensity of exposure to the treatment.
No, that is pretty cool. Brilliant. Ericka, thank you very much for being here with us. Sorry, we should interrupt you because of the time. Because of the time. I encourage people to...
That part is the saddest part, because that's the part of biases.
I encourage people to read Ericka's work, going through her papers, scientific papers, because her work is absolutely excellent. Thank you very much for being here, Ericka, and talk soon.